When I sat through the reading of my late husband's will, I expected grief, not humiliation. But when my daughter-in-law, Rachel, stood up halfway through and calmly announced that I was being excluded from further distributions, I swear the air left the room. I didn't even cry. I'd spent the last year of Patrick's life lifting him in and out of bed, feeding him when his hands shook, holding his head when he couldn't hold down water. And now Rachel was speaking about me like I was a line item on a spreadsheet. The lawyer looked startled at first. Then something strange happened. He chuckled under his breath. Rachel stiffened, her posture tightening like a string pulled too tight. I just stared at him. Why would he laugh in a room like that? Afterward, I wandered out to the garden behind the funeral home. The guests were gone, leaving behind half-empty cups and the smell of lilies turning sour in the sun. Rachel had organized everything, from the slideshow to the napkins, just like she'd planned every other moment of Patrick's illness. Perfect. Polished. Sterile. Patrick would have hated it. He always said funerals should be messy, real. Let people forget their umbrellas, he used to joke. If it's neat, it's fake. As I stood among the folding chairs and damp grass, I realized this whole thing wasn't about grief anymore. It was about control. When I went back inside, Rachel was packing folders into a sleek leather bag. "We'll move forward with the legal process next week," she said without looking up. Her voice was flat like a voicemail played too many times. She handed me a small box with Patrick's name on it. "He asked me to give you this." Inside was a silver tie clip. No note. No explanation. Just cold metal and a silence that said, "This is all you get." That night I sat in my kitchen with cold tea, surrounded by a house that still smelled like him, and yet somehow didn't feel like mine anymore. For the first time since Patrick died, I had a question I couldn't shake. What was so funny to that lawyer? And what had Rachel done to make him laugh? The house didn't feel like home anymore. Every corner carried Patrick's scent. Aftershave, coffee grounds, old books, but the warmth was gone. It was like someone had quietly erased me from our story. I tried to convince myself I was just tired, still grieving. But grief doesn't send cold drafts through a house that's been sealed tight. Something deeper had shifted. 3 days after the funeral, an email arrived. No condolences, no greeting. Just a subject line. Estate administration meeting. Wednesday, 9 a.m. It was from Rachel's assistant, not even Rachel herself. Formal, sterile. I almost deleted it, but some stubborn part of me clicked, accept. The law firm was downtown, sleek glass, polished floors, eucalyptus candles at the front desk. A young receptionist looked at me like I'd wandered in from another world. Maybe I had. When I entered the conference room, I counted 7 people, all in dark suits. Rachel sat at the head of the table. Her posture screamed power. She didn't stand, didn't greet me, just gave a tight nod toward the chair farthest from her. I sat down, hands folded, invisible. She started the meeting like a CEO giving quarterly results. Assets, accounts, property, stocks. My name didn't come up once. Then one of the associates asked, "And Mrs. Hart's share?" Rachel didn't even blink. "There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the finalized will." The words hit like a slap. No emotion. No hesitation. Just finality. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just sat there while the room filled with the sound of paper sliding and pens clicking. Sounds that would haunt me later. When the meeting ended, Rachel packed her things slowly, almost daring me to say something. I didn't. I walked out, letting the cold November air hit my face like a wake-up call. By the time I reached my car, one sentence kept replaying in my head, her sentence. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her. That wasn't just about money. That was about identity. I wasn't a wife, not even a widow. I was an afterthought. But I wasn't done, not yet. Because if Patrick truly changed that will, I would have known. And if I didn't, it meant someone else made sure I didn't. And I was about to find out who. I didn't turn on the lights that night. The house felt too quiet, like it was holding its breath. Patrick's cane still leaned by the back door where he'd left it after his last chemo appointment. I hadn't moved it. Couldn't. I sat in the dark until the streetlights flickered on outside. I wasn't sure what hurt more. Rachel's arrogance or the realization that everyone else in that room had gone along with it. No one had questioned a thing. Later, I walked into Patrick's study. I didn't go there much anymore. His scent still lingered, a mix of tobacco and pine. My hand went straight to the desk drawer he used most, the one that always stuck halfway. He used to say he'd fix it. He never did. The drawer creaked, and for a second it felt like he was still here. Inside were the usual things. Old receipts, worn notebooks, pens that didn't work. But tucked behind an old ledger was a small manila folder I didn't recognize. No label. No date. Just paper. I opened it carefully. Inside were 3 sheets. The top one was handwritten, Patrick's handwriting. Shaky but his. Rachel wants me to update the will. Says it's just to reflect current holdings. I'm not sure why it feels wrong. Haven't signed anything yet. Haven't told Evelyn. She'd ask the questions I'm afraid of. I read it twice, then again until the words blurred. He knew. He'd sensed something. The second page was a draft of the will, different from the one Rachel had read. My name was still there, clear as day. It said Patrick left me the home, the accounts, the trust. But it had been crossed out. A note in the margin read, "Discuss with Rachel." The last page listed legal appointments. 2 of the dates matched weeks when Patrick had been too weak to walk. He'd never told me about any meetings then. I sat back in his chair, folder in my lap, heart pounding so hard it hurt. He hadn't signed this version, not yet. Which meant somewhere between those drafts and his final breath, Rachel made sure he did. But how? And why did the lawyer at that meeting laugh like he already knew? I looked down at the tie clip she'd handed me at the funeral. It surfaced dull in the lamplight. Maybe it wasn't a keepsake. Maybe it was a message. And I was ready to start reading between the lines. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Patrick's handwriting. Those uneven lines and the words, "I'm afraid." I wasn't sure if the fear was for him or for me. By morning, I'd read that note so many times I could quote it by heart. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. Rachel had interfered with something that wasn't hers. But I needed proof. Patrick had an old friend, Daniel Cross. They'd worked together for years before Patrick retired. Daniel was a lawyer. Not corporate like Rachel, but the old-school kind, the kind who still believed in fairness. We hadn't spoken in ages, but I found his number scribbled in one of Patrick's old planners. When he answered, his voice was calm, familiar. I barely got through the first few sentences before he said, "Meet me tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you found." The next day, I met him at a small cafe off Maple Street, one of those places that still served coffee in chipped mugs. Rain streaked the windows. It felt like the world outside was holding a secret, too. I slid the manila folder across the table. Daniel read every page in silence. His brow furrowed deeper with each line. When he finished, he looked up at me. "This isn't just suspicious." he said quietly. It's orchestrated. He started jotting notes in a small legal pad, drawing connections between dates and names. He circled something I hadn't noticed, the witness signatures on the updated will. I didn't recognize either of them. Patrick always used neighbors or friends as witnesses, people he trusted. These were strangers. Daniel tapped his pen against the table. She brought in outsiders. That's how she kept you in the dark. I felt my chest tighten. He said he'd start with official county records, cross-checking what had been filed and when. He told me not to confront Rachel yet. Silence gives you power, he said. Use it. When I got home, I tucked the folder into the old lockbox with our passports. My hands were still shaking. Before bed, I opened Patrick's old calendar again, flipping through the last few months of his life. And there it was, one name circled twice in pencil, Harold Givens. I remembered the name faintly. He was a tax consultant Patrick had met years ago. But why had Patrick met with him again just weeks before he died? And why hadn't he told me? Something about Harold felt like the missing thread. And I was ready to start pulling. The next few days felt endless. I tried to keep my routine. Make coffee, water the plants, call my sister. But everything I did felt like moving through fog. My mind stayed fixed on that one penciled name in Patrick's planner. Harold Givens. I called Daniel first thing Monday. He said he'd reach out quietly. If this guy had any role in Patrick's estate planning, he might have seen something Rachel didn't want you to. I tried not to expect much, but when Daniel called me 2 days later, I could hear the shift in his voice before he said a word. Evelyn, he started. I spoke with Harold. You need to hear what he told me. I pressed the phone to my ear and listened. Harold remembered Patrick coming into his office months before he passed. Thin, pale, but sharp. They'd talked for over an hour about the trust and about keeping me protected. Patrick had even asked about adding extra provisions for my care. But Harold said Patrick seemed uneasy. He kept saying, Rachel's handling it. She knows the details. Harold had offered to review everything independently, to make sure it was all transparent, but Patrick never followed up. A week later, Rachel called Harold directly and told him Patrick no longer required his services. Her tone, he said, was clipped final. Daniel's voice softened. Harold still has his intake notes, Evelyn. They're not legal documents, but they show intent and doubt. That could matter. I thanked him, though my voice barely worked. When I hung up, I just sat there staring at the phone. Patrick knew something was wrong. He tried to ask questions but backed off. Maybe he thought Rachel was helping him. Maybe he didn't want to worry me. Either way, he left me with a puzzle and half the pieces missing. That night, I pulled out our old photo albums, hoping for comfort. Instead, I noticed something strange. Rachel was in nearly every picture from the past decade. Always in the background, always smiling, always close enough to be useful but never out of sight. I used to think that meant loyalty. Now I wasn't so sure. When I closed the last album, my hands were shaking again. But not from grief this time. Rachel hadn't just been helping Patrick. She'd been preparing for something. And I had a feeling that something was finally starting to unravel. By the weekend, I had stopped pretending to be calm. Every time the phone rang, my heart jumped. Every knock at the door made me brace. It wasn't paranoia, it was instinct. On Monday morning, Daniel called again. His tone was tighter this time. Evelyn, I found something odd in the county records. He explained that Patrick's final will, the one Rachel presented, had been filed under a different case number than the original draft from the year before. That shouldn't have happened. Normally, any updates are filed under the same case and tracked with notes. But the first version, it was gone. Marked as superseded, no trace of who changed it. Someone replaced the entire record, Daniel said. And whoever did it knew what they were doing. He told me he wanted to bring in another expert, a probate specialist named Lydia Vasquez. She handled contested wills and document fraud cases. I agreed, though part of me hesitated. What if we uncovered something that made everything worse? We met Lydia 2 days later at Daniel's office. She was in her 50s, composed and sharp-eyed. She barely took notes, just listened. Then she asked for everything. Copies of Patrick's drafts, Rachel's notices, even the folder I'd found. When Daniel mentioned the 2 unknown witnesses, Lydia's brow arched. "Those names have come up before," she said quietly. "They've been tied to fake notary work in a few estates. People paid to sign off without the actual signer present." My stomach twisted. Fake witnesses. Lydia leaned back, thinking. "This wasn't sloppy," she said finally. "It was built." The room went still. Before I left, Lydia promised to file a quiet inquiry with the probate court. If Rachel tampered with filings, there'll be a trace. An email, a timestamp, something she forgot to erase. That night, I went out to the garage for the first time in weeks. The air was cold, smelled faintly of oil and cedar. Patrick's old filing cabinet sat in the corner, still locked. I opened it and started digging. Bills, tax records, letters. Then, tucked behind a folder labeled Trust Addendum, I found something new. An unsigned document titled Revocable Living Trust, Survivor Protections. My name was still there. My notes in Patrick's handwriting filled the margins. He hadn't erased me. She had. And for the first time, I stopped feeling like a victim. I started feeling like a witness. I barely slept that night. Every sound in the house felt amplified. The ticking clock, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards when I paced. I kept thinking about that unsigned trust document. Patrick had wanted to protect me. Somewhere along the way, he'd been convinced not to. The next morning, I brought the file to Daniel's office. Lydia was already there when I arrived, reading through papers with the kind of focus that made the room go still. I slid the document across the table. She read it once, then again, then exhaled softly. "This helps a lot," she said. "It shows his intent to keep you protected." She explained her next step. A motion to preserve assets. It wasn't dramatic. It just meant the court could temporarily freeze all estate funds and property. Rachel wouldn't be able to move or sell anything until things were clarified. It wasn't revenge, it was protection. I nodded. "Do it." 3 days later, Lydia called. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge of satisfaction beneath it. "The motion's been approved," she said. "Everything is frozen for now." For the first time in weeks, I let myself breathe. That same afternoon, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting was precise, too neat to be casual. Inside was a formal printed invitation. A tribute to Patrick Hart, hosted by Rachel Hart. Location: the Oak Ridge Country Club. Date: 4 days from now. Cocktails. Hors d'oeuvres. Charity auction. It was glossy, embossed, expensive, and insulting. Rachel hadn't called, texted, or even acknowledged that we were now on opposite sides of a courtroom. But she had the nerve to invite me to a public celebration of my husband's life, as if I were some distant relative. I didn't throw it away. I slid it into the drawer by my couch and stared at it all night. Rachel thought she had me cornered, that I'd be too humiliated to show up. She was wrong. I wasn't going to cause a scene. I wasn't even going for her. I was going because I wanted to see her face when she realized the story she thought she'd rewritten was about to start writing itself back. And I'd be there for the first chapter. Saturday came faster than I expected. I almost backed out twice that morning. The idea of walking into a room full of people who believed Rachel's version of events made my stomach twist. But Patrick used to say, "Courage doesn't always roar. It just keeps showing up." So I showed up. I wore navy slacks, a silk blouse Patrick had bought me for our anniversary, and a thin silver chain. Nothing flashy but intentional. The parking lot at the country club was already packed. The kind of cars that don't see dirt roads. At the door, a young man in a tux handed me a program. "Welcome, Mrs. Hart," he said politely, not realizing the irony. Inside, the room was all glass and gold light. Polished wood floors, tall vases of lilies, and a photo of Patrick near the bar. The one Rachel had chosen for his obituary. He looked tired in it. She'd said it showed grace and struggle. I thought it showed exhaustion. Rachel stood near the center of the room like she owned the air around her. Perfect hair, perfect smile, every move practiced. She greeted donors like she was running for office. When she finally saw me, her smile faltered for half a heartbeat before snapping back into place. "Evelyn," she said smoothly, walking over. "I didn't think you'd come." "I wasn't planning to," I replied. But then I realized Patrick would have wanted at least one real person here. Her lips tightened. "Enjoy the evening," she said, turning away before I could add anything else. I wandered toward the silent auction table. It was filled with Patrick's favorite things. A signed baseball, a set of golf clubs, even a first edition book I'd given him years ago. There was no mention of me anywhere. A man approached me, introduced himself as one of Patrick's old business partners. He spoke kindly, asked how I was managing the estate. When I told him I wasn't the trustee anymore, his face fell. "That can't be right," he said quietly. "Patrick always said you were in charge together." That comment landed like a stone in my gut. Rachel hadn't told anyone the truth. Not about the will, the trust, or even this event. She was rewriting history in real time. I stayed another 20 minutes, just long enough to overhear a board member mention that Rachel had been handling transfers and titles even before Patrick passed. By the time I reached my car, I wasn't angry. I was focused. Rachel had built her power on silence. And she was about to learn what happened when silence finally spoke back. By Sunday morning, I was done pretending this was about grief. It wasn't. It was about control, and Rachel had been rehearsing that role for years. I met Daniel and Lydia the next day at his office. They both looked exhausted but alert, like people who'd been living on caffeine and purpose. I handed them the notes I'd made after the event, every overheard comment, every inconsistency. Lydia read in silence, tapping her pen against the margin. "This isn't just financial," she said finally. "This points to intentional manipulation, maybe even coercion." Daniel nodded. "We'll move to contest the will." The words hung in the air, heavy but freeing. I left the office feeling like I could finally stand up straight again. I wasn't fighting for the money, it was about the truth. Patrick's truth. Mine. 2 weeks later, the court accepted our filing. It was just the first hearing, brief, procedural, but it meant one thing. Rachel couldn't keep hiding behind paperwork anymore. When Lydia told me, she said, This opens the door for discovery. We can request internal emails, financial records, witness statements. Everything she's touched. That night, I sat in Patrick's study, looking at his photo on the desk. I whispered, "We're not done yet." Days passed in a blur of signatures and coffee cups. Lydia's team pulled together timelines, phone logs, transaction reports. I'd never realized how much paperwork could tell a story until now. Then one afternoon, Lydia called me into her office. She had a printed email in her hand, dated 6 weeks before Patrick passed. The subject line read, "Revised structure, immediate actions." The sender? Rachel. The message was short but clear. She'd instructed her team to finalize trust documents and remove discretionary clauses. My name appeared once. Remove co-beneficiary privileges per our discussion. That was it. My life, my marriage reduced to one cold sentence. Lydia looked at me carefully. This proves awareness. She knew what she was changing, and why. I felt my throat tighten, but I didn't cry. Not this time. Then we move forward, I said. I wasn't sure if Patrick had meant to protect me, or if he'd just run out of time. But one thing was certain. Rachel had counted on me to stay quiet. And for the first time since that reading, I wasn't. The silence that built her empire was about to become the sound of it cracking. By the end of that week, the case felt like it had taken on a life of its own. Lydia's office walls were covered in color-coded notes, timelines, and copies of Patrick's documents taped like a crime map. Every thread seemed to lead back to Rachel. Thursday morning, Lydia called me. "We've got something," she said. "One of the witnesses who notarized the revised documents has agreed to talk." Her name was Ava Kendall, a paralegal from Rachel's firm. She'd recently left her job and, according to Lydia, wanted to clear her conscience. The following Tuesday, I arrived early at Lydia's office. The city was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels like the world is holding its breath. Inside the conference room, Daniel was sorting through files, and Lydia stood by the window, coffee in hand. When Ava arrived, she looked younger than I expected. Mid-30s, nervous but composed. She sat down, folded her hands, and said softly, "I just want the truth out there." She explained that Rachel had brought her into the estate revisions about 6 weeks before Patrick died. From the beginning, things felt off. Standard procedures were skipped. Meetings happened after hours. There were missing witnesses. Then Ava described one night that made my skin crawl. She'd returned to the office late to grab her jacket and saw Rachel inside the conference room with another staffer and a stack of unsigned papers. Rachel asked her to notarize a signature. Ava hesitated. Patrick wasn't there. Rachel told her he'd just stepped out, insisted it was urgent. Ava signed. Later that night, guilt got to her. She wrote a note in her planner. 7:43 p.m. Sunday. Witness signature for R. No P present. Ava pulled out that page, yellowed and creased, and slid it across the table. My heart thudded in my chest as Lydia read it aloud. That one line changed everything. If Patrick hadn't been there when those documents were signed, it meant Rachel forged them. Or worse, someone else had. Lydia leaned back, exhaling. This isn't circumstantial anymore. This is evidence. I looked at Ava, grateful but furious at the same time. She'd helped Rachel's lie come to life, but she was also helping expose it now. After she signed her statement and left, the room went quiet. Daniel finally broke the silence. "Rebecca just lost her foundation," he said, voice low but certain. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. Because for the first time, I wasn't standing in the shadows of someone else's version of my life. And I knew Rachel was about to feel what it was like to live without control. 2 days after Ava's statement, the retaliation came. A thick envelope from Rachel's attorney landed on my doorstep, heavy with legal threats and polished arrogance. The letter accused me of interfering with lawful estate administration and acting out of emotional instability. In short, they wanted me to back down or pay the price. I read it 3 times. Then I folded it neatly, placed it beside my coffee, and called Daniel. He answered on the second ring. "I figured you'd get something like that," he said. "They're trying to scare you." "Well," I told him, "they picked the wrong woman for that." He laughed softly, but there was pride in his voice. "That's the Evelyn I remember." That afternoon, Lydia filed a full rebuttal. It included Ava's written statement, the document timestamp showing office activity on a Sunday, Patrick's earlier drafts, and even the notary metadata that proved he couldn't have been present when his final signature appeared. As Lydia sealed the envelope for submission, she looked at me and said, "This isn't just a legal case anymore. This is a story of record." That night, I sat on the back porch, blanket wrapped around my shoulders. The air was cool, and for the first time I didn't feel the cold in my bones. I listened to the trees rustling. Patrick had planted those maples 30 years ago, promising they'd outlive us both. He'd been right. I thought about how Rachel must have felt, seeing her perfect plan begin to crumble. But it wasn't satisfaction I felt. It was steadiness. A kind of quiet justice that didn't need noise or revenge to exist. A few days later, another letter came, but this one wasn't from her. It was from Patrick's old foundation. They were holding a board meeting to finalize the transfer of authority, Rachel's final step in cementing her control. And they'd invited me to attend. I stared at the letter for a long time. I knew exactly what she was doing, putting on another performance. But this time I wasn't coming as a widow or a victim or even an afterthought. I was coming as the truth she couldn't bury. And this time I was the one who'd be setting the stage. The foundation's new office was a tower of glass and ego. Exactly the kind of place Rachel would choose to run her legacy. I arrived 5 minutes early, just to remind myself I didn't need to rush anymore. The receptionist led me into a boardroom filled with familiar faces, people who'd once toasted anniversaries in our backyard, who'd called me Evie with warmth and now looked at me like a ghost from a chapter they'd stopped reading. Rachel sat at the head of the table, dressed in navy, her hair pulled into a sleek knot. She looked like control personified. When she saw me, a flicker of something crossed her face, surprise then composure. "Evelyn," she said smoothly, "I didn't expect you." "I know," I replied. The meeting began, full of the kind of language that sounds impressive but says nothing. Continuity, transparency, legacy. When they reached the item labeled Transition of Executive Oversight, Rachel rose to speak. She thanked everyone for their support through a difficult time. Then she paused and said something that made the room still. "And with Evelyn's grace, I carry Patrick's vision forward." Her words landed like glass breaking inside me. My grace? The grace she'd stolen and signed her name under? I smiled small, calm, and reached into my bag. "Speaking of grace," I said, sliding a small envelope toward the man sitting next to her. "Patrick's oldest friend." He opened it, confusion flickering across his face. Then he began to read. One by one, the others followed, passing the papers around. Ava's notarized statement, Lydia's summary, and a copy of the altered page Rachel had submitted to the court. When the last paper reached Rachel, her smile didn't falter, but her hand trembled. I stood. "Thank you for inviting me," I said evenly. "If anyone needs clarification, my attorney will be in touch." Then I walked out. No dramatics, no raised voice. Just silence, the kind that carries its own gravity. By the time I reached the parking lot, my pulse had slowed. For the first time in months, I wasn't holding my breath. That night, Lydia called. "They postponed the vote," she said. "The board's opening an internal review. Rachel's lawyer has gone quiet." I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where this all began, and for the first time in a long while I didn't feel small. Rachel had tried to erase me from the story, but I'd just written myself back in permanently. And I still had one more truth left to reveal. The silence after that board meeting was almost eerie. No phone calls. No letters. No smug legal threats signed with Rachel's name. Just quiet. Lydia warned me not to confuse stillness with safety. "When people like her go quiet," she said, "it means they're regrouping." But this time I wasn't the one who needed to prepare. I had already said everything that mattered. A week later, Lydia called again. "You might want to sit down for this," she said. Rachel had withdrawn from the foundation. No press statement, no confession, just a tidy exit. Her official reason? Preserving Patrick's legacy. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I just felt done. The following Tuesday, the foundation released a short announcement naming a temporary oversight committee made up of Patrick's oldest colleagues. One of them sent me a note that simply read, "You were right to protect what mattered." That was all I'd ever wanted, to protect what was real. A few weeks later, Lydia brought me the final paperwork. Everything had been recorded. The corrections, the statements, my rightful name restored in the trust. She asked if I wanted to pursue damages, but I told her no. This wasn't about money. It never was. It was about being seen again. About making sure the truth had a heartbeat. That evening, I went through Patrick's desk one last time. Buried behind an old ledger, I found an envelope I'd never opened before. Inside was an earlier draft of his will, dated a year before Rachel's edits. In his handwriting, he'd written, "For Evelyn, so she'll always know this life was ours." I sat there until the sun dipped low, the light spilling across the paper like a quiet benediction. Weeks passed and spring began to show itself, the first green shoots pushing through frost. I started volunteering again at the community garden Patrick and I helped fund years ago. The plaque out front still read, "For those who plant for a future they may never see." I ran my fingers over the worn metal and smiled. Rachel's power had always come from rewriting things, documents, histories, people. But she forgot one thing. Stories written in truth don't fade. They endure. And mine, ours, was still here. When I got home that night, I brewed tea, opened the back door, and let the cool air in. For the first time in a long time, the silence around me didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Because I was no longer the woman erased from the story. I was the woman who finished it.